So, what are the Russians and Ukrainians up to again? The Russians lost 800 soldiers and thousands of pieces of equipment in the last day. Ladies and gentlemen, today we'll take a look at the Russian losses on the front and in the war. We'll explain that the losses being reported are inaccurate and actually don't tell us how many people the Russians have really lost. We'll explain why all of this is, let's say, slightly manipulated, but at the same time, we'll look at how Russia is now having problems recruiting volunteers, why Russia is facing the threat of mobilization, and what steps they've already taken to increase the number of volunteers so they don't have to carry out mobilization. Because the fact that today I'm going to talk about Russia facing the threat of mobilization and running out of soldiers doesn't necessarily mean that Russia has to mobilize or that it will actually run out of soldiers. It just means that Russia has several options for solving the whole situation, but those options are getting fewer and fewer, and the threat of mobilization is getting bigger and bigger. As I said, Russia having losses and running low on soldiers doesn't mean they'll run out completely. It just means they'll have to manage the situation. And we'll talk about why there are fewer and fewer options for solving that problem. And again, we're getting to the top of the pyramid, the threat of mobilization. But first, those losses. Here on Ukrainian Pravda, we have the number of Russian losses promoted by Ukraine. For the entire war, it's actually almost 4 years now, 24. On February 24, it will be 4 years since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Here we have 1,250,000 lost dead soldiers, 11,667 tanks, 24,000 citizens, 37 armored vehicles, 37,000 artillery systems, and so on and so on and so on. The losses are in the thousands and tens of thousands. But it's important to realize one thing. We always repeat it and we'll repeat it again. What is a loss? A loss is when a soldier on the battlefield is captured, goes missing, or deserts, is wounded, or is killed. All of that counts as losses. The moment that soldier, for example, goes to the front, gets hit in the leg, and is taken to the hospital, that's one loss. Then the soldier recovers, right, goes back to the front, and at the front he gets some serious illness, because of which he has to be taken to the hospital again. That's loss number 2. Then the soldier recovers, returns back, and during some offensive operation ends up as a prisoner. That's loss number 3. Then he's released during a prisoner exchange, returns to the fight, and during an offensive operation he's killed. That's loss number 4. At that moment, one person, one Russian soldier, here in the current column of Russian soldier losses, loss number 4, actually counts as 4. So that means the actual human losses in terms of how many people really died will be much lower, significantly lower than 1,250,000. There will be significantly fewer dead, and at the same time, there will also be significantly fewer wounded in the end, because it could happen, for example, that one soldier was wounded twice, so he is listed in the losses as if it were twice. For this reason, this counting and estimating of losses is very inaccurate, very much so. You can't just think that 1 million Russian soldiers died. By the way, the same applies to Ukrainian soldiers, and it's exactly the same, for example, with tanks. People often ask me, how the heck is it possible that Russia lost 11,000 tanks when at the start of the war they had about 4,000, they had thousands more in storage, and in the factories they produced only a few hundred new tanks? How could they lose 11,000 tanks? That sounds unbelievable, but it's true, right? You have a T-90 here, it gets destroyed, you send in a recovery tank, it tows it away, takes it to the repair shop, you fix the tank and send it back into battle. And then the tank gets destroyed again, so you repair it again and send it back into battle, and so on into battle, until it happens that the tank is completely wrecked and can't be repaired anymore, or until the Ukrainians capture the tank, or until you can't reach the wreck, the destroyed tank, because it's too deep in Ukrainian territory. At that moment, you lose the tank, you can't send it back. But again, just like some soldiers were lost several times, some tanks were lost several times too. That's just about these losses. These losses are more of an estimate, it's just an approximation. However, what's much more interesting is the next piece of information. And that's the information that says, the Russians are losing more soldiers than they are able to recruit. This information is important for several reasons. First, interest in serving in the Russian army is declining. Russia will have to address this somehow. Second, the size of the Russian army is decreasing because more soldiers are being taken out of service than are being enlisted or brought back into service. This is very serious information because the shrinking of the Russian army is something that hasn't really been common here. Of course, Russians have died in large numbers, but Russia has always managed to compensate for it. They were always able to replace those people. Now, for 2 months in a row, they haven't been able to just make up for their losses, but they've actually lost significantly more than they've been able to recruit. Last month, I think it was 6,000 people in the negative, and this month it was already around 8,000 people in the negative. So what does that mean? It means that in the last 2 months, the Russian army has nominally shrunk by about 14,000 people. That doesn't mean they lost 14,000 people. It means they lost much more, but they shrank by 14,000 because they couldn't compensate for those losses. They couldn't recruit them. And why couldn't they recruit them? That brings us to another thing that happened in Russia and is happening in Russia right now. They couldn't recruit them also because there are uncontrolled social networks in Russia, like WhatsApp or Telegram. Through WhatsApp or Telegram, Russian propagandists and Russian military bloggers showed the reality of the war. Many times they showed the reality of the war, sometimes a slightly altered reality, but they showed the horrors of war. These horrors of war, of course, don't work very well as an advertisement for war. So, for this reason as well, and also because people were getting better and better information about how terrible the war really is, the interest in joining the army and fighting in that war decreased. On Telegram and on social networks that still worked in Russia, information was spreading that wasn't exactly promotional in nature. So the first step for Russia to compensate for not being able to recruit enough soldiers is to block the media through which anti-advertising about their military operation is spreading. Of course, this also has its downsides. For example, soldiers use these social networks to communicate with people back home. This significantly demoralizes the Russian army when they can't use WhatsApp or Telegram to communicate with people back home, with their families, and so on. At the same time, some Russian soldiers have already sent messages to Roskomnadzor, which is the regulatory authority that oversees social networks, asking them not to ban these social networks. Because Russian soldiers directly on the front line use Telegram or WhatsApp to communicate with each other. They can do this because these social networks are encrypted and it's very difficult to eavesdrop on them if you don't want anyone to monitor you. So, it's a relatively safe way for soldiers to communicate with each other, coordinate, and so on. Of course, Russia wants to ban it for another reason as well. Not only because anti-propaganda is spreading there, which makes recruitment harder for them, but also because dissidents communicate there, or resistance as such is organized there. Some sabotage actions were even organized there. So, for this reason as well, the Russians want to ban these social networks. And sure, this could have the effect that suddenly those nasty things stop spreading around, because they'll have all the information flows from the front under control, and that could increase interest in the army. But at the same time, it could also decrease interest in the army, because the soldiers will know they can't communicate, that they can't contact their families without strict control, and overall the organization of the army will decline. It declined when they had Starlink problems. So this is kind of a double-edged sword. Another way Russia could deal with the lack of interest in joining the army would be to increase soldiers' salaries. That could solve the situation. But the problem is that Russia doesn't really have the money because the price of oil is very low, and the Russian budget is based on the assumption that the price of Urals oil per barrel will be around $70, which is definitely not the case right now. And Russia isn't really making money from oil extraction, and there are times when it's even losing money. Now, in winter, it will be better, but in summer, for example, the demand for oil is lower because there's not as much heating and so on. And therefore, the price is also low. So, since Russia doesn't have enough money from oil, it also doesn't have enough money in its emergency fund, and it doesn't have enough precious metals left to sell either. Recently, it was getting by selling precious metals, gold, silver, and so on, when the prices of these commodities were high. But since these resources are drying up and are at a minimum, Russia has to do things like confiscating and nationalizing property. As for nationalizing property, last year Russia had to nationalize, and get this, the property of 24 entities worth a total of $11 billion. As for nationalization the year before, back then they only nationalized property worth, in quotes, $3.8 billion. So, the Russians and their nationalization activities are escalating, and they're escalating as their ability to make money and cover the losses from that war declines. By the way, the sanctions are working. Besides that, as I said, the Russians can't increase the salaries for their soldiers, and they're trying to compensate for it with that nationalization. Then, of course, they're also trying to compensate for it by raising taxes. And overall, the Russian economy is suffering a lot. It's mainly the private sector that's suffering, especially those not tied to government contracts. We have nationalization, we have high interest rates, we have high inflation, we have low earnings from oil extraction, and we have trade isolation because India is distancing itself from them and reducing its purchases. We have increased competition from Canada towards China. Namely, that China will buy oil from Canada, so it won't buy as much from Russia, where it's risky and there's a threat of sanctions or tariffs from the United States. Overall, we have a combination of many circumstances here that are harming the Russian economy. And that means it prevents the Russians, or at least limits their ability, to pay high salaries to their soldiers, and thus to cover their losses and, let's say, make up for what the Ukrainians kill compared to what they recruit. And that brings us to the specter called mobilization, to the top of the pyramid, because that's where they're heading, since they're running out of options to solve the whole situation. They can't significantly increase salaries, so they can't significantly boost voluntary recruitment. Russian society is numb and no longer properly motivated. And mobilization itself is just one of the solutions for how to accomplish this. How to deal with this. The second solution would be to end the war. So in the end, Russia and Vladimir Putin will have to choose between two decisions. Mobilization and risking that Russians will eat him alive for it, just like they did with the Tsar, or ending the war and risking that Russians will eat him alive for it, just like they did with every weak leader. Vladimir Putin is being pushed into a very 6-7 situation. So we'll see how he gets out of this and which path he chooses. However, mobilization in Russia is becoming more and more likely at this moment. And that's because they're no longer able to supply their army with enough manpower voluntarily. So that's it, ladies and gentlemen. Please write in the comments what you think about it. Definitely don't forget to send a nice contribution through the QR codes. For our bold viewers from Germany, Spain, or the United States, please send international payments through the PayPal QR code. Those of you watching from the Czech Republic, for example, can use the bank transfer option available here. Or, of course, you can use super chats and things like that. That also helps a lot. And last but not least, sharing, likes, and your comments to support the algorithm itself. And definitely join the streams because there we watch what the world is up to again and you can be a part of it. Have a great time for now and bye.